Down, Determined, and Delivered. A true story of resilience and redemption. Part 1. Homeless, not hopeless. A father's fight to stay standing. He had just $21 in his pocket. One toddler. No home. A line of people stretched around the block, all hoping for a chance at a bed in the shelter. The sun was setting fast, and the only thing Chris Gardner was sure of was that he wouldn't let his son see him cry. Not because he wanted to hide his pain, but because he wanted his son to feel safe. To a child, a parent's tears can feel like the world unraveling. Chris knew what it was like to grow up surrounded by uncertainty, and he refused to let that shadow fall on his little boy. If his son still believed in him, then Chris had to hold it together, at least on the outside, before success, before Wall Street, before the best-selling memoir. There was this moment. A father, gripping his sleeping son, crouched on the cold tile floor of a subway bathroom, pretending it was just another sleepover. Chris Gardner's story doesn't start with a miracle. It starts with disappointment, struggle, a slow unraveling of dreams. But even here, at rock bottom, something powerful stirred in him. Not rage, not bitterness, but something harder to hold on to. Hope. Rewind just a few months. Chris was a medical device salesman in San Francisco, hustling to sell high-end bone-density scanners. On paper, they sounded like a great opportunity. He had spent his savings on several machines, thinking he could make a good living, maybe even grow a business. But the hospitals he visited told a different story. Doctors were polite but firm. Some didn't even let him finish his pitch before ushering him out. The scanners were considered a luxury, too expensive and not covered by most insurance plans. In a time when budgets were tightening, hospitals prioritized necessities. Diagnostic tools like the ones Chris was selling fell to the bottom of the list. He carried them from one appointment to another, hopeful at first, then desperate. The machines, once symbols of opportunity, became a heavy reminder of what hadn't worked out. Eventually, they gathered dust in the trunk of his car, silent witnesses to the dream that was slipping through his fingers. Every rejection chipped away at his confidence. The bills kept coming. Rent, parking tickets, daycare. Every day felt like a new wave crashing over him, pulling him further from the life he had imagined. But still, he refused to quit. Because quitting meant confirming what the world seemed so eager to believe, that he wasn't good enough, that he didn't belong. He refused to let poverty define his son's future or failure define his own. Deep down, he believed that if he kept showing up, no matter how bruised, no matter how broken, something would change. He had to believe it. For his boy, for himself, for the promise he had made long ago, that he would never disappear, never give up, and never stop fighting for something better. He had grown up without a father. He had promised himself, "My son will never know that pain." He had lived it, spent too many nights wondering where his next meal would come from, or who would show up to take care of him. That kind of uncertainty leaves invisible bruises. Chris was determined to shield his son from that kind of instability, to be the anchor he never had. Even if he didn't have much, he would give his son something priceless, the comfort of knowing someone would always be there. But now, that promise felt fragile. His relationship with his partner, the mother of his child, began to fray. Long days of rejection turned into long nights of tension. Arguments. Cold silences. One day, his partner simply left, taking what little money was left in the account and leaving their toddler, Christopher Jr., behind. Chris wasn't angry. He was afraid. How was he supposed to give this little boy a stable life when his own was hanging by a thread? They were evicted, first from their apartment, then from the motel. Eventually, even the shelter turned them away one night. Too full. Chris had arrived early, holding his son's hand, hoping that maybe this time they'd be high enough on the list. But as the line inched forward and the sun dipped behind the buildings, a staff member stepped out with weary eyes and a clipboard. He didn't need to speak. The subtle shake of the head told Chris everything. There would be no room tonight, no mat, no warmth, just the streets and the choice to stay moving or find somewhere hidden to rest. Chris tightened his grip on his son's hand, his heart sinking under the weight of another closed door. And that's how they ended up in a subway station bathroom, locked in a stall, pretending it was part of a game. Chris sat on the toilet, holding his son against his chest, trying to hum softly as the boy drifted off to sleep. He could hear the echo of footsteps outside the stall, the low hum of the fluorescent lights above, the clang of a distant train coming and going. But inside that small square of space, he focused on steadying his breathing, calming his heartbeat, willing himself to stay strong. And when little Christopher asked, "Is this where we live now?" Chris just nodded and said, "It's just for tonight, little man." He turned away so his son couldn't see the tears. What do you do when your dream is gone, but your child is still watching? You keep going, because giving up doesn't just mean letting yourself down. It means letting go of the only thing holding your world together. Chris knew that if he collapsed, everything else would collapse with him. He had no safety net, no second chances lined up, but he had a pair of tiny eyes watching his every move, learning what strength looked like. He kept going not because it was easy, but because love made it necessary. Because even if the world had stopped believing in him, his son hadn't. And that was enough to take one more step, and then another. That night, Chris whispered a prayer into the dark. "God, I don't need easy. Just give me a shot." It wasn't the first time he had prayed like that, but this time, it came from a deeper place. Not just desperation, but defiance. A quiet, burning refusal to give up. This prayer wasn't a plea. It was a line drawn in the sand. It was Chris daring the darkness to do its worst, while he chose to hope anyway. He didn't ask for comfort. He asked for a shot. A chance to prove he could rise from nothing and still become something. That moment, whispered in the dark with a sleeping child on his chest, became a turning point. Not because circumstances changed, but because his will did. He thought about the moments he wished he could bottle up and save. His son's giggles when they played peekaboo in the park, the way he held his hand tightly crossing busy streets, the way he called him Dad D, like it was the most important word in the world. Chris had nothing to offer but his time, his determination, and his love. He couldn't write a check or promise stability. He didn't have titles or savings or even a spare key to call his own. But he had presence. He had consistency. He had a heart that refused to give up on the little boy looking up at him with trust-filled eyes. And sometimes, love is the strongest currency, the kind that pays in peace, in hope, in moments of safety no money can buy. He remembered his own childhood, the pain of being passed between relatives, the confusion of watching adults disappear from his life. He had known hunger, not just for food, but for affection, for safety, for someone to stay. And that memory became fuel. He would be the one who stayed, not just physically, but emotionally, present in every moment, every scraped knee, every bedtime story. He wanted his son to know, without a doubt, that someone would always be there to tuck him in, to show up, to stand tall even when the world felt like it was falling apart. Chris didn't want to repeat history. He wanted to rewrite it. There were nights they sat together on park benches, sharing a day-old sandwich from a church pantry. Christopher thought it was an adventure. Chris let him believe it. He made up stories, made up names for the stars, turned sidewalk cracks into train tracks and shelter mats into camping trips. He taught his son to count not just numbers but blessings, even the little ones. A warm meal, a dry place to sit, a kind smile from a stranger. He wanted Christopher to see goodness not just in abundance, but in simplicity. Because sometimes, when everything else is stripped away, it's the smallest things that carry you through. Gratitude, Chris believed, could be a lifeline. The next morning, with his suit rumpled and no time for breakfast, he walked into an office building downtown. He wasn't there for a handout. He was there for hope. A brokerage firm. Dean Witter Reynolds. He had seen a man park a red Ferrari out front months before. He had asked the man 2 questions. "What do you do? How do you do it?" The man told him, "I'm a stockbroker." Chris had made up his mind in that moment. He wanted in. He wanted a future where he could provide, not just survive. He studied financial terms at night using brochures he picked up from the library. He watched the suits walking out of the building and imagined himself among them, Not because he craved wealth, but because he craved peace, security, a future for his son. But the odds were stacked against him. He didn't have a college degree, not even a full resume to hand over. He had never worked in finance and didn't speak the language of Wall Street. His days had been spent navigating hospitals, cold calling doctors, and hauling bulky scanners in and out of his car, not managing portfolios or making trades from behind a sleek glass desk. He had no mentors to vouch for him, no inside contacts to open doors, no letters of recommendation to lend him credibility, just persistence, a handshake, and a willingness to learn faster than anyone else in the room. And, most pressing of all, no money. He couldn't afford fancy suits, couldn't take long lunch breaks to network, and couldn't stay late without risking shelter for his son. Every minute was a calculation between ambition and survival. Most interns had families supporting them. Chris had a toddler and a dream. That was it. Dean Witter offered a 6-month internship. Unpaid. Just one position would be offered a full-time job at the end. Chris said yes, to 6 months of unpaid work, to long hours and sleepless nights, to the grueling pressure of outperforming every other intern while living without a home. He said yes to the impossible because it was the only path forward, because even the slightest chance was better than no chance at all, because sometimes hope doesn't wait for certainty. It moves when the door cracks open. So every day, Chris Gardner showed up in a worn-out suit and worked harder than anyone. He studied after his son fell asleep. He smiled through exhaustion. He made cold calls with a warm voice. He believed in something no one else could see yet. Not just success, but a future built from scratch, for the sake of someone he loved more than himself. There were days he had to sprint from the office to pick up his son before daycare closed, knowing if he was late, Christopher would be taken away. There were nights they waited hours in shelter lines, then woke up at 4 a.m. to stand in line again. And through it all, his son never knew how close they came to giving up. He never saw the nights Chris cried in silence, or the mornings he skipped meals so his boy could eat. Christopher only knew that his dad was steady, present, and strong. He didn't see the panic behind the smile or the fear behind the bedtime stories, only that his dad was there. Every day. Like clockwork. Like love that refused to quit. When Chris looked into his son's eyes, he saw something he couldn't afford to lose. Trust. That pure belief that Daddy could fix anything. He didn't have the luxury of collapsing, and somehow, even in the chaos, there were moments of joy. They laughed at pigeons in the park. They danced to street musicians. They shared secrets like best friends. Chris didn't just want to build a better future. He wanted his son to remember that even in the worst of times, he was deeply, unconditionally loved. But 6 months is a long time to work for free when your child is hungry and the nights are cold. One man would be chosen at the end. Chris was all in. The question was, would it be enough? End of part 1. Sometimes the most powerful victories begin in the places no one sees, on cold bathroom floors, in whispered prayers, and in the arms of a child who still believes. Stay with us for part 2, where hope meets hard choices, and determination is tested in the fire of impossibility. Part 2. The Climb. One chance, no guarantee. He was always racing the clock. Every minute of his day was spoken for, planned, stacked, and weighed. One wrong turn, one late train, one extra question at daycare pickup, and the entire system could collapse. He didn't have the luxury of slowing down. There was no car waiting, no backup babysitter, no flexible boss. Being late could mean losing his internship. Missing pickup could mean losing his son. And every delay carried the weight of a life already stretched too thin. For Chris, time wasn't just precious. It was survival. Every morning, Chris Gardner calculated his day down to the minute. There was no room for error, no cushion. Every second was survival math. From the moment he dropped Christopher off at daycare to the minute he entered the Dean Witter office, he had to be laser-focused. He couldn't be late. He couldn't be average. He couldn't waste time. Because when you're a homeless father pretending everything is fine, you don't get second chances. There's no margin for failure. One slip, one missed detail, and everything you've worked for could vanish. No one lowers the bar because you're exhausted. No one adjusts expectations because you haven't eaten. Chris knew that if he showed even a hint of weakness, the door he'd fought to walk through could close behind him forever. So he performed under pressure. hiding every hardship behind a steady voice and a pressed collar. His circumstances couldn't be allowed to speak louder than his potential. The internship was unpaid, but the work was real. Phones rang constantly, cold calls, sales quotas, pressure. Chris wasn't the only one hoping for the full-time offer at the end. Every intern was hungry. Most were younger. Most had degrees, families with money, or apartments to go home to. Chris had none of that. But he had a reason stronger than anyone else in the room. A little boy who believed his dad was a hero. Chris borrowed confidence he didn't feel. He wore the same suit again and again, washing it in public restrooms at night and drying it on bathroom stalls. He tied his tie with muscle memory while calming a crying child. He walked into the office every morning acting like he had slept on fresh sheets, not a subway floor or shelter cot. What set him apart wasn't his resume. It was his drive. While others clocked out, he kept working. While others took breaks, he made calls. He found ways to do in 6 hours what others did in 9, because he had to pick up Christopher before the daycare shut its doors. He couldn't afford to be ordinary. Ordinary wouldn't open the door at the end of the internship. Ordinary wouldn't erase the nights on concrete or the fear of losing his son. In a room full of polished resumes and practiced charm, Chris knew he had to shine in a way that couldn't be ignored. He needed every call to count, every moment to matter. He needed someone to see that behind his secondhand suit and tired eyes was a man with unmatched hunger, someone who was building a future with nothing but grit and love. Ordinary was a luxury for those with safety nets. Chris didn't have that, so he had to be unforgettable. Still, there were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable. Days when rejection piled on top of fatigue, when the smile felt too hard to fake and the hunger in his own stomach threatened to blur his focus. Days when he had to act like everything was under control, even when he didn't know where they'd sleep that night. And yet, he kept going. He reminded himself that this wasn't just for a paycheck. This was for a future, for dignity, for the day his son would look back and know his father never stopped fighting. Christopher was too young to understand the stakes, but he understood love. He understood rhythm. The way his father held his hand, walked him to daycare, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "I'll see you soon, little man." That kind of consistency builds trust. Chris made sure that no matter what chaos they were living through, his son never missed that rhythm. It was stability in the middle of a storm. There were nights Chris studied by the light of a street lamp, reviewing financial terms while his son slept beside him wrapped in a donated blanket. There were mornings when he skipped food so Christopher could eat something warm. On weekends, when other families went to parks or restaurants, Chris scouted for resources. Food banks, churches with free meals, shelters that didn't ask too many questions. He got creative. He got resourceful. He got desperate. He bartered services, juggled public transportation routes like a strategist, and found ways to stretch $1 into 3 meals. He memorized library hours, shelter rules, and where to find free coffee. He called in favors from strangers and made friends out of the overlooked. When the doors he knocked on stayed shut, he knocked on new ones, sometimes just for a moment of rest, sometimes for hope. Desperation became a daily companion, but it never took hold of his heart, but never bitter. Chris refused to let his circumstances harden him. He wouldn't let anger take root, not when his son was watching, learning what it looked like to carry yourself with grace under fire. Bitterness would have been easy, even justified. But Chris knew bitterness was a thief, stealing joy from the present and hope from the future. He wouldn't let it rob him of his identity or set a template for the kind of man his son would one day become. So he chose something harder. He chose gratitude, finding it in the smallest blessings, like a warm cup of donated coffee or a stranger's kind glance. He chose humility, holding his head high not in pride, but in quiet dignity. And he chose to believe, truly believe, that tomorrow still had something good waiting, that if he kept walking, even with blistered feet and a weary heart, he would reach it. All he had to do was not give up. Somehow, even in the pressure cooker of performance, he kept his heart soft. He still smiled at strangers, those hurried passers-by who never knew the weight he carried. Still said thank you, even when the kindness was small and the exhaustion was great. Still told his son stories that ended with hope, even if he had to whisper them while fighting tears of his own. Chris knew that his son wasn't just listening. He was learning. And if Christopher could grow up believing in love, gentleness, and perseverance even in hardship, then Chris knew he was succeeding in the ways that mattered most. He didn't want his son to remember just the struggle. He wanted him to remember the strength, the quiet kind, the kind that shows up and stays even when it's hard. He wanted him to feel the warmth of a father who made bedtime stories out of shelter walls, who turned soup kitchen dinners into picnics with purpose. Chris worked to make even the darkest moments feel like something steady, something sacred. He wanted time with his son to feel safe, even when the world outside was crumbling. Because to Chris, the greatest victory would be if his son remembered not just what they went through, but how they loved each other through it. There was one day, in particular, when everything almost fell apart. Chris had made a mistake, a small misstep in a call that cost the firm a potential client. It was an honest error, but in an environment where competition was brutal and the stakes were high, it felt catastrophic. He thought he'd be dismissed. He walked into the meeting holding his breath, rehearsing apologies. But his supervisor looked at him and said, "You show up early, you work hard, people notice that. Keep going." It was simple, almost too simple. But to Chris, those words were like oxygen. In a world where so much of his effort went unseen and unacknowledged, here was proof that someone had noticed. Someone had been watching. Not his homelessness, not his struggles, but his work ethic, his commitment, his refusal to quit. It was the first time in a long time someone in power had affirmed his value. And in that moment, something shifted. He walked out of that office with the same suit, the same stress, and the same obstacles, but with a fire in his chest that hadn't been there the day before. He had made an impression. He mattered. For the first time in a long time, someone had looked past his circumstances and seen the man underneath. The effort, the integrity, the fire. Even if it was just a flicker of recognition, it was proof that he wasn't invisible. It told him he wasn't just surviving, he was starting to be seen. Even if just barely, it was enough to keep going. Enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was getting closer to the moment everything would change. So he doubled down. He networked when he had nothing to offer but a firm handshake and a genuine question. While others relaxed in the break room or grabbed food from the nearby cafe, Chris pulled out a stack of notes and sat quietly at his desk, poring over financial concepts he hadn't known existed a few weeks earlier. Sometimes he barely touched the sandwich he brought, his focus sharpened by necessity, not appetite. He was exhausted, but this time mattered. It was the only quiet window in his day, and he used it not to rest, but to rise. He needed to understand the terminology, master the numbers, and prove, most of all to himself, that he could belong in this world of suits and sales. He wasn't just studying to pass the time. He was studying to change their lives. It wasn't about extra credit. It was about survival. He knew that every new term he memorized, every strategy he absorbed, brought him 1 inch closer to a life where his son didn't have to sleep on shelter mats. While others chatted in the break room, he leaned into focus like it was oxygen. He treated every cold call like it was his shot at changing everything. He reminded himself that a future was waiting, one call, one breakthrough away. Sometimes the hardest part wasn't the work. It was pretending like he didn't carry the weight of 2 lives every day. When someone joked about his worn-out shoes or his frayed cuffs, Chris just smiled. No one knew he had to choose between those shoes and dinner. He learned how to deflect with charm, to answer questions without revealing too much. Because if they found out he was homeless, he was afraid they'd stop seeing his potential and only see his problems. Every day he was building a bridge towards something better. 1 phone call at a time, 1 train ride, 1 sleepless night. And through it all, Christopher kept believing. Every night, Chris would kneel beside his son, whether on a shelter mat or a park bench, and whisper, "One day, we'll have a place of our own, a room with a door that locks and a bed just for you. I promise." He didn't know when. He didn't know how. But he meant it. And that promise, spoken quietly in the dark, became his mission. It echoed in his thoughts as he made cold calls, studied financial formulas, and tucked his son into makeshift beds. It wasn't just a dream. It was a vow, a sacred contract etched not on paper, but in a father's soul. No matter how tired he was, no matter how far the finish line seemed, that promise reminded him who he was running for. It became the thread that stitched his broken nights together, the quiet determination that whispered, "Don't stop. He's counting on you." There were moments of private celebration too, tiny victories that no one else noticed. The day he scheduled more appointments than anyone else on the floor. The moment he finally understood a complicated financial model he had been studying late at night. The first time a senior broker casually asked for his help instead of overlooking him entirely. He held on to those moments. They reminded him that forward was still forward, even if it was slow. He began to sense a shift, not in his circumstances, but in himself. The fear that once drove him was now being slowly replaced by purpose. Each day no longer felt like a desperate attempt to keep from drowning. He was learning, adapting, growing. The pressure hadn't lessened, but something within him had expanded. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building, steadily, courageously, brick by brick, choice by choice. With each act of discipline, each ounce of patience, each small success, he was laying the foundation for a future, one that couldn't be shaken by his past. People started to remember his name. A few interns asked him questions. A couple of brokers nodded when he passed. One even stopped to compliment his phone skills after a particularly sharp cold call. These were small gestures, barely noticeable in the fast-paced environment of the office. But to Chris, they meant everything. They were tiny cracks in the wall that had separated him from the world of belonging. Moments that whispered, "You're earning their respect." For a man who had spent months unseen, only surviving, only enduring, it meant he was no longer invisible. It meant they were starting to see not just his presence, but his potential. Even Christopher could feel the change. He started to draw pictures of Daddy's work, stick figures with phones and big smiles, always with a little boy beside them. Chris tucked those drawings into his briefcase like armor. On the hardest days, they reminded him why he couldn't stop. Because the climb wasn't just for him, it was for the little boy watching. End of part 2. Some battles are fought quietly, in pressed suits that hide exhaustion, in routines that build trust, in sacrifices no one will ever see. Join us for part 3. When a door finally opens, and a father's quiet perseverance changes everything. Down, determined and delivered. A true story of resilience and redemption. Part 3. The door. When preparation meets opportunity. There's a moment in every journey when everything hangs in the balance. Not because the path has suddenly changed, but because you have. For Chris, that moment came on a Thursday. Ordinary on the surface, but extraordinary in consequence. He'd been tracking his numbers, watching his performance. He knew he was gaining ground, but so were others. The end of the internship was approaching. Only 1 or 2 offers would be given. The tension in the office was quiet but sharp. Every intern felt it. Even when they smiled at one another, you could feel the undercurrent, competition laced with hope. Chris arrived that day with the same ritual, shirt freshly pressed in a shelter bathroom, Christopher safely dropped at daycare, tie tightened with practiced hands, breath steady. But something felt different. Not easier, not certain, just aligned. Like all the weight he'd carried was slowly forming something solid beneath him. Like he wasn't climbing a crumbling wall anymore. He was scaling a mountain he had built himself. A mountain forged from every sleepless night, every closed door, every whispered prayer in the dark. What had once been survival now felt like purpose. Every challenge had given him a new foothold. Every painful step had become part of a path only he could walk. Mid-morning, he was called into a meeting. No warning, no preamble, no heads up from a secretary, no heads turning in curiosity. Just a name called, a door opened, and a heart suddenly hammering in his chest. He walked in with heart pounding, palms slightly damp, eyes focused. Not because he was afraid, he was past fear, but because hope had never felt this close. His breath caught in his chest as the door clicked shut behind him. The room was warm, quiet, full of the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and the weight of possibility. A senior manager stood up from the far end of the table, a folder in hand. He didn't gesture for Chris to sit. He just looked him in the eye, steady and direct. "You've got the highest numbers on the floor," he began, his voice calm but firm. "You're consistent, you're respectful, and above all, you've got heart. We notice those things. He paused just long enough for Chris to feel the world hold its breath. Then came the words Chris had carried mountains to hear. "We'd like to offer you a position." The air shifted. The fluorescent hum faded. Time seemed to slow as those words landed in Chris's chest, like sunlight breaking through after years of cloud cover. He had imagined this moment so many times, lying on shelter floors, gripping cold coffee cups in meetings, whispering promises to his son in the dark. But nothing could have prepared him for the way it felt to finally be seen, not as someone trying, but as someone chosen. Chris froze. Not because he was shocked by the offer. He had worked for it, fought for it, but because of what it meant. It meant no more running to shelters, no more lying awake counting coins, no more choosing between food and bus fare. It meant a door was finally opening, not because someone had taken pity on him, but because they had seen his worth. Tears welled in his eyes, but he didn't let them fall. He nodded, shook hands, and thanked them. Then he walked to the restroom, locked the stall door, and wept. Not just from relief, but from validation. From the overwhelming realization that his unwavering perseverance had not gone unnoticed. That someone had looked past his homelessness, his resume gaps, his secondhand suits, and seen the fire in him that refused to die. This wasn't about luck. This was about deservedness. The kind that's forged in the furnace of setbacks and sealed by the strength to keep going anyway. Every night on a shelter mat, every skipped meal, every whispered promise to his son, it had led here. He didn't call anyone right away. Instead, he walked outside, stood in the sun, and let the moment settle. The city noise faded behind him, the shouts, the car horns, the bustle. In its place, stillness. He tipped his face to the sky and closed his eyes. The sunlight warmed his skin, and for a few sacred seconds, the world felt perfectly quiet. He whispered, "Thank you." It wasn't just a prayer of gratitude. It was a prayer of endurance, because he had made it through without breaking. A prayer of humility, because he knew not everyone who fought as hard got this far. A prayer of reverence for the invisible grace that held him together when nothing else could. And most of all, a prayer of trust, because even in his darkest hours, when logic said, "Give up," his faith whispered, "Hold on." This was not the end. It was a holy pause, a sacred breath before the next chapter. And in that quiet, he knew, his story wasn't just about one man's rise. It was about love that never let go. That night, when he picked up Christopher, he didn't say anything at first. He just hugged him longer, walked a little slower, listened a little deeper. Then, when they sat down on the park bench with their sandwiches, he said, "We're going to be okay." Christopher, still young enough to live in a world of trust and imagination, nodded and said, "I know, Daddy." Chris smiled, because somehow, his son did know. There was no hesitation, no question, no doubt. That little boy had never stopped believing, not once. Even when their shoes had holes or dinner came from a shelter cafeteria. Even when Chris was quiet with worry or worn out from rejection, his son's eyes still shone with certainty. He had complete, unshakable faith that his dad would take care of him. That love was enough, that presence was power, and that belief had been Chris's anchor, his reason, his fuel. The next morning, Chris woke up with the same suit, but a new beginning. He arrived early, just like always, but this time, he walked in through the front doors not as an intern, but as an employee. He bought a small binder and wrote on the inside, "Day 1. Not of work, of freedom." It would still be hard. Bills would still come. Challenges would still test him. But now he had ground to stand on, a salary, a title, a desk with his name. Later that week, he took Christopher to a diner. Not because it was fancy, but because it had booths and pancakes. And because for once, he could pay without counting every coin. As they ate, Christopher leaned into his dad and said, "I like it when we don't have to hurry." Chris blinked hard, because that's what this was about. Not the money, not the title, but the stillness. The ability to sit with his son and not be haunted by the ticking clock. That moment, like the job, was earned. And in the years to come, Chris would rise higher than he'd ever imagined. He would become a stockbroker, a motivational speaker, even write a best-selling book. He would sit across from CEOs and inspire audiences with his story of resilience and grace. But all of that started not in a boardroom, but in a shelter, in a bathroom, with a man refusing to let go of his dignity. Because before there was success, there was struggle. Before there were accolades, there were sacrifices. Before there was recognition, there was quiet resolve. He hadn't just walked through a door of opportunity, he'd built the key from scratch, out of tears, hope, and unwavering resilience. He had carved a life from hardship and turned heartbreak into legacy. There would be more lessons to come, more doors to knock on, and more people to inspire. But for Chris, that door wasn't the end of the climb. It was the beginning of a new mountain. He often said in later interviews, "Don't ever let someone tell you what you can't do, not even yourself." And he meant it, because he had lived it. He had pushed through the impossible with a child's hand in his and nothing but faith in his heart. Because what Christopher needed most wasn't a rich father. It was a present one, a faithful one, a father who didn't just promise better days, but proved every day that they were possible, who told stories at bedtime not about fairy tales, but about real courage, the kind that wears a tie one minute and cleans a public restroom the next. And maybe that's what success really is. Not just reaching the top, but refusing to let the climb change your core. In the end, the real reward wasn't the job offer. It was becoming the man who could say, "We made it," and know that every moment, every tear, every setback was worth it. The end. Thank you for joining us on the Karma, Kindness, and Consequences channel. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if this story inspired you, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that persistence pays off and love never quits.